verbal today.
Bill, if you do that, it's 10:40.
Here he is.
Okay, let's get started. We're glad to see you this morning. I want you guys, if you don't know Craig Keith, you need to get to know Craig Keith. He's for 20 years taught Open Bible, and he is taking a break from teaching for 20 years straight. And let me tell you something else about Craig. He's doing something. He came to our Belong Team meeting a few weeks ago. He's doing a very neat thing. He's visiting 12 churches that are similar to Brewster in their, what would you say, their beliefs? Is that how would you call it?
Well, 12 churches that are dissimilar.
Dissimilar, but
the criteria is they have to believe in the Apostles' Creed, but other than that, I'm trying to pick out churches that have fairly different belief styles or worship styles than us.
So keep talking. You're visiting 12 churches.
Yeah, Assembly of God, Christian Science, Eastern Orthodox, Mormon, etc., etc. Yeah.
And he's learning about this, and he's we put a bug in his ear from the Belong Team to find out how are you welcomed, how are you, and what can we learn from some of those experiences. So anyway, Greg's going to do that, and he's going to share his experiences later on. So anyway, we're glad to have Craig with us today. Let's go through the announcements. We have several. We have the very first one. We have two of our women that I know are out at the women's retreat. I can only suspect that the rest of you women are charging if you're not retreating. So I guess both Vicki Beasley and Linda Dills are both at that one. Tiffany Wright's reception is next Sunday. Don't forget that. Blood drive today. That's going to be tough for Linda to be calling on blood drive day since she's there.
You know, she actually doesn't. She doesn't do somebody else organizes.
No, I mean, she's just PR.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Okay, this is a neat thing. You need to look on page 8 of your order or your worship folder. That someone has donated a bunch of money for a solar and LED project to save electrical energy here in the church. That's really a cool thing. The story is on page 8, lower left. Ash Wednesday service this week. Laura and I are in first grade Bible skills, and the first graders are going to go into there at the 7 o'clock family friendly time. So there's a 6 o'clock more for adults, and so so 7 o'clock for the children. Wednesday Lenten meditations are happening on Wednesday, March 4th and 11th. And George Gagliardi's having a concert today at 6:30 p.m. So that would be interesting to see. Heather, as always, has something going on. Housing stabilization program. Carrie, do you know anything about that? Where's Carrie?
No, I'm here. I read about it here, but, well, yes, I do too. Because the women, this has been brought up one time before with the missions committee, and it just couldn't, I don't know why, we couldn't get it going. But women that get out of Austin Center,
yeah,
and they get their own apartment, they were finding that shortly, it wasn't permanent for them. They could stay, but they missed the community. They felt isolated there. And they would go back out on the streets because they needed that connection. So the deal is that you call it's once a week, I believe.
Yeah, I think that's what it says here, yeah.
Yeah, something like that. And they have a list of questions that you'll ask them, and depending on you report that, and that kind of gives them a clue on if they see a danger sign, they're getting close to going back, and they can work with them.
So Heather's needing volunteers for that, for you to
Yes.
do phone calls on that, which could be done anywhere, it says.
You don't have to leave your house,
Right.
you don't have to go to their apartment, it's
Right.
all about that.
And there's a training on that on April 6th. That's on page 9 of your worship folder.
Now, I'm telling you what I know from previously when I was on the
That's pretty much what it says in here, so that's good. Contemplative retreat is going to be on Friday, April 24th through Sunday, April 26th. There are pantry volunteers needed at City Square and Wilkinson Center. And Room in the Inn is happening again February 28th and 29th and March 27th through 28th. And I think that's pretty much it. The youth choir, of course, spaghetti luncheon on page 11. The ones that came, I thought we were having 2 people came in. They had a whole crowd that came in last time. I guess we talked about it, so we'll do that. Now, I got an email from somebody this week, and I got to tell you, I've slept since then. Somebody's coming in, I think, again, this Sunday or next, but we'll find out more about that. There's a Road to Resurrection, that's on page 13, and a special film screening on March 8th with lunch served right after church. Nice article from Scott Spryer, also on page 12 of your worship. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, this isn't in there, we've just been told about this in choir, but if you have more money than you know what to do with, and you want to buy some choir robes, they're $210 a piece, and Doug will take the money. So that's just if you have more than you know
Okay,
what to do.
there you go. So choir's getting new robes, okay, all right. Very good. Anything else church-wide we need to do? I'm gonna send the prayer requests around. I didn't see any birthdays on this list. Oh, I am gonna send this around again. I think we're full on this, and I need to see Lisa Mershon, because Mary Carver says she's got all the paper goods. I'm gonna move her to something else, so, here, I'll send this around. I don't know if we need anything else. Please come. Correct, you should come next week as well. We're having brunch with Quarter 3. And I think we're starting off in their classroom. And I think they're gonna set up round tables for us all to talk and eat together in this classroom. And then we're gonna have a 20-minute devotional, if you will, from Charles Yarbrough to keep us on track, because we've got 104 lessons to get through in 2 years, so he'll keep us moving on that. So, at any rate, if there's nothing else, Bill, I appreciate you. Thank you very much.
You bet. I mentioned this a couple of years ago in here, but several of you are new, so I want to repeat it. I have a dear friend who was Minister of Education at Broadway Baptist Church in Fort Worth. And Dennis and Laura moved from Fort Worth to Knoxville, Tennessee. And when my friend found out they were moving to Dallas, he called me and said, you need to make sure that Dennis and Laura join Wilshire.
Absolutely.
And then he said, they're the finest lay couple I've ever worked with.
Yeah, we owed him money.
That's right.
So I just want you to appreciate them for who they are.
They're wonderful.
Well, today we're taking a look at the life of Joseph. And if you drew a picture of a dysfunctional family, there's no such thing, by the way, as a functional family. Every family has it, you know. But Joseph's family was about as dysfunctional as you can get. And so let's turn to Genesis chapter 37 and take a look at this dysfunctional family. We'll read verses 1 through 8. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zebullah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made a richly ornamental robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf arose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around me and bowed down to it. His brother said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Now, isn't that a nice family? Have you ever known people who had multiple children and loved one more than the other? Yeah, I have too. I have some good friends who had 2 sons, and they loved the younger son more than the older son. And the older son knows it and has talked to me about it. And so when I'm with them and the sons are there, who are grown men and married, when the sons are there, I always pay special attention to the older brother because he feels neglected by his parents. Not the end of the story. My friends have 4 grandchildren, 3 girls and a boy. They love the boy more than the 3 girls. And it's evident. It's for all to see. And they are aware of it, and when I talked to them about it, they said, yeah, that's the case, we can't help it. Well, you can imagine what this does to children. When one child feels that another child is loved more than they are. And, I mean, it's evident here. When Jacob made a coat of many colors, or ornamental coat here, this thing's in my way. When he made that coat, boy, he wasn't doing Joseph any favor. He was further alienating him from his brother. Now let's look on down to verse 18. Between 8 and 18, Jacob said to his favorite son, Joseph, go down and check on your brothers. They're tending the sheep in Dothan, and go check them and bring me back a report of how they're doing. So he did. Verse 18. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan, but they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Pretty harsh treatment. They changed their mind. They saw these Ishmaelite traders coming, and they said, you know, instead of killing this guy, why don't we just bloody his coat? So they killed a goat and put blood all over Joseph's coat and pulled Joseph out of the cistern, the pit into which they were thrown him, and sold him to the Ishmaelite traders. Now the Ishmaelite traders took him to Egypt, and they sold him to Potiphar, one of the officials of the Pharaoh in Egypt. So the promise is still alive. You know, God promised that he would make of Abram many nations. And it might have come to an end had Joseph been destroyed. But the promise is still alive through Joseph. And let's look now at chapter 39, verses 1 through 4. After Joseph had been sold to Potiphar. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So he left in Joseph's care everything he had. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. So Joseph, cream rises to the top. And Joseph was blessed, and Potiphar was blessed because of Joseph. Now let's skip on down to the 6th verse. So we read the 6th verse. Let's read on down through verse 19. Beginning with verse 8. we find that Potiphar's wife came and took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me. But in verse 8, Joseph refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater than in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day he went into the house to attend his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by the cloak and said, come to bed with me. But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. And when she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and run out of the house, she called her household servants. Look, she said to him, this Hebrew has brought us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. The Hebrew slave you brought to us came to me to make sport of me, but as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. Now, Joseph is in a mess. When I was a young pastor, before I was married, I was out visiting. I was visiting everybody in the community, trying to build up this little church I was in. We were in about 25 a Sunday. And so I decided I was going to visit every house in the community and invite them to church. I went up to this one house, didn't even know their names, and knocked on the door. And this young woman came to the door and invited me in. Well, I assumed her husband was there. And as soon as I found out he wasn't there, I made the visit very quick and left. Well, word got out in the community. Had to be murder. Word got out in the community that I had visited this young woman when she only had her short shorts on, which she did. And her husband was not home. Now, she didn't say anything happened, which it didn't. But the implication was there. And I'm telling you, I spent some miserable weeks trying to deal with that because there was no one to know any different. And it finally blew over. But
There's fake news back then too.
I'm sorry?
You said there was fake news back then too.
There definitely was.
A soap opera to begin with.
Yeah.
Mrs. Robinson.
Yeah.
But I'm really identified with Joseph here because of that experience in my life. Joseph was powerless to rebut her story because nobody else was there to know the truth. And so Joseph is in a bind. And in chapter 40, we find that Potiphar threw Joseph in prison because he naturally believed his wife. And so Joseph is a hard-luck character. I mean, thrown in the pit by his brothers, sold into slavery, and now put into prison. So you can't be much down on your luck more than Joseph was. Now, while Joseph was in prison, Pharaoh's cupbearer and his baker were thrown into prison. And they had a dream. The cupbearer dreamed a dream that he didn't understand, and he shared it with Joseph. And Joseph said, well, here's what's going to happen. In 3 days, the Pharaoh's going to come and deliver you from prison and restore you to your former place as cupbearer. Well, the baker had a dream. He came to Joseph and he said, here's my dream. And when he finished, Joseph said, well, here's what's going to happen. In 3 days, Pharaoh's going to come after you and hang you. And he did. And the cupbearer was restored to his place of honor. And Joseph said to the cupbearer, when you're restored to your place of honor, remember me, intervene for me with Pharaoh, and try to get me out of this prison. The cupbearer forgot all about it and didn't say a word to Pharaoh about it. Let's turn to 41 and look at verse 17. The Pharaoh said to Joseph, by the way, the cupbearer, Pharaoh had a dream, and he shared his dream with the cupbearer. And the cupbearer remembered then Joseph in prison. And he said, hey, let me tell you about this guy in prison. And he told Pharaoh about Joseph interpreting his dreams for him. So in verse 17, Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream I was standing on the bank of the Nile, when out of the river there came up 7 cows, fat and sleek, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows came up, scrawny and very ugly and lean. I've never seen such ugly cows in all the land of Egypt. The lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came up first. But even after they ate them, no one could tell that they had done so. They looked so ugly. Then I woke up. In my dreams, I also saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads sprouted, withered and thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 good heads. I told this to the magicians, but none of them could explain it to me. Do you have dreams that you just don't understand? Saturday morning, my lovely wife, over breakfast, Bill, I had the strangest dream last night. Now, when she dreams a lot, I don't dream much. But usually when she tells me her dreams, I can figure out something that's happened recently that probably prompted those dreams. I'm not a magician or psychic or anything like that. It's just trying to use a little logic. Well, this dream, she and her friend went to see our family doctor. And the family doctor put them on a bus and got on the bus with them and took them to a place that they didn't recognize. And then the dream ended. She says, what in the world was that on? I have no idea. Well, she worried about that dream all day long. Trying to figure out, what caused this dream to happen like it did. Well, you can imagine Pharaoh struggling with this crazy dream that he's had. Well, let's see what it happens. In verse 25, Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It's one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain, scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. So Joseph brings the good news and the bad news to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh acts on Joseph's dreams, and he puts Joseph in charge of everything in Egypt. And Pharaoh doesn't worry about anything. Reminds you of Potiphar. Cream rises to the top. And so here Joseph is in charge of everything. Now, Pharaoh's dreams come true. And they have 7 years of plenty. And Joseph stores up all the grain. And he really does a number on the Egyptians. The Egyptians, in the first years of famine, ran out of grain. So they came to Joseph for grain. And Joseph said, well, if you'll give Pharaoh all your animals, I'll give you some grain. So they gave Pharaoh all their animals. They were starving to death. Joseph gave them grain. And when the food ran out, they came back to Joseph. We're starving to death. Joseph said, I'll tell you what, if you'll give Pharaoh all of your land, I'll give you some grain. So they gave Pharaoh all of their land, and Joseph gave them some grain. Had plenty of grain because he had stored it all during the 7 years of harvest. That's pretty ruthless, but pretty good for Pharaoh. Now, during this time, the famine wasn't just in Egypt. It spread all over the Middle East. And it hit Joseph's family. And so the family heard about the Pharaoh having all this grain in Egypt. So Jacob says to his boys, I'm going to send the 10 of you to the Pharaoh to see if you can get some grain for us. And he gave each of the 10 some silver with which to buy the grain. But he kept his youngest boy, Joseph's full brother. The rest of them were half-brothers. But Benjamin was Joseph's youngest brother. And we find in verse 42, chapter 42, that Jacob was not very smart. He hadn't learned his lesson. And he loved Benjamin more than he loved the other 10. And just as he had loved Joseph more than the other 10, now he switches his love to Benjamin more than the other 10. And when he says to the 10, you go to Egypt and buy grain with this silver that I'm giving you. And Ben's going to stay home with me. Well, how do you think the brothers felt about that? So they went to Egypt and confronted their brother Joseph, not knowing that he was their brother. And you'll remember from the story that Joseph did not reveal himself to them. And he ordered his servants to fill up their bags with grain, but to put the money back in the bags. So the servants did as Joseph had commanded them to do. And on the way home, Joseph said to his servants, go and confront them and tell them that I want Simeon to come and stay with me until they bring their younger brother to see me. Because in his first meeting with them, Joseph had said to them, what about your aged daddy? How's he doing? Well, he's doing fine. Well, what about your younger brother? How's he doing? Well, he's doing fine. So when they were on the way home, Joseph's servants met them and said, I want to examine your bags. Well, they hadn't examined their bags. They didn't know the money was there. And when they discovered that the money was there, you can imagine what they thought. They thought, this guy's going to accuse us of stealing the money. And so the servants said to the boys, tell you what, you let Simeon come back, and you all go back home with the grain and the money, and I'll exchange Simeon for a visit with your younger brother. Well, they went home. They told their daddy what had happened. And they said, Daddy, we can't get Simeon back unless you let us take Benjamin back to see Joseph. They didn't know it was Joseph. And Jacob said, no way. No way. My favorite son was killed, and now you want to take my next favorite son, and he'll be killed. No way. But you know, hunger does a lot of things to you. And the longer they waited, the hungrier they got when all the grain was gone. And Jacob relented, because Judah said, tell you what, I'll leave my two boys in your care, and I'll take Benjamin back to see this guy. And if anything happens to Benjamin, you can kill my two sons. Well, Jacob was hungry, everybody was hungry, and Jacob didn't see any other way to feed his family except that. So he finally relented and let Benjamin go with them, with their empty sacks and the silver that they were supposed to use to buy the first round of grain, and head back to Joseph. In verse 44 of chapter 42, look at verse 44. No, wrong verse. In chapter 43, instead of verse 43, it's chapter 43. Here they go back to Egypt with Benjamin. And they have the grain, empty sacks for the grain, and the silver. And they go back to Joseph a second time. And let's look at chapter 45. Well, in chapter 44, they go back to to Joseph a second time with empty sacks. And this time, Joseph has their empty sacks filled with grain, puts the silver back into their sacks, and he puts his personalized silver drinking cup into Benjamin's bag. The boys head back home. Joseph sends his servants after him again and stops and says, somebody has stolen my silver drinking cup. And Simeon said, no, none of us have done that. You can empty our bags and look. And they opened their bags, and sure enough, the silver drinking cup was in Benjamin's bag. And so they took Benjamin back to Joseph and sent the boys back home with the instructions that they were to bring their daddy back to see him. And let's look at what happened in chapter 45, beginning with verse 1. They came back after their sacks had been, before they'd gone back home to get their daddy. In chapter 45, we find that they had already opened the sacks, found the silver cup. They come back to Joseph before they go back home. And in chapter 45, Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants. And he cried out, "Have everyone here leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard him. Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there's been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will not be plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God." Now, Joseph had the right perspective. He saw things looking back, that he hadn't seen in current circumstances. He didn't think God sent him to the Ishmaelites to be sold as a slave. He didn't think God put him in prison. But now looking back, he saw things from a different perspective and saw the hand of God in his life. Hindsight's always better than foresight, isn't it? I know when I went to work for CBF, I look back on my 35 years as a pastor and saw how God had groomed me for that all the way through. My first months at CBF were a real test of faith, because I resigned the pastor of First Baptist Abilene, a wonderful church, to go to work for this new organization, and we didn't know if we could pay our bills or not. And it was a real leap of faith. But then I began to see something. I began to see that I'd grown up in Oklahoma, I'd pastored in Oklahoma, I'd pastored in Arkansas, I'd pastored in Tennessee, I'd pastored in Texas, and I knew people in all those states. And I started calling on pastors that I had known in those 4 states and talking to them about becoming part of CBF. And I didn't know when I was a pastor that God was grooming me for that. But looking back on it, I saw it very clearly. And every one of us have stories like that in our own lives where we didn't see things clearly when we were experiencing it. But looking back on it, can see things. I've shared with this class before that I lost my mother and a brother and an aunt and an uncle, and we wound up at the children's home in Oklahoma City. And at the time I was enduring all that, man, I was one miserable human being. I developed a chip on my shoulder that I was looking for people to knock off. But looking back on that, that broke a cycle of poverty in my family. My dad was never able to read and write. I had one uncle that had been to college. My mother had 11 siblings, and one uncle had been to college. So there was no dream in my young life of ever finishing high school. I mean, it wasn't even a thought. I would do what my two older brothers had done, go to school and all the work on the farm. And so, you know, when it was happening, I saw it all as bad. And looking back on it, I see the hand of God in breaking a cycle of poverty in my life. Not that God killed my mother. I don't want to infer that at all, because I don't believe it. My mother died because we couldn't afford medical care for her, and she knew it, and so she never went to a doctor. Folks, there are a whole lot of people in our society who need medical care, who just can't get it. They just can't get it. And so I understand Joseph looking back and saying, yeah, this all happened for good. God turned something bad into good. Remember what it says in Romans 8:28? God works all things together for good to those who love Him. And God doesn't cause the bad. I don't want you to go out here thinking that. But God takes the bad and turns it out for good. And so, Joseph sent his 11 brothers back to their father and said, you bring the family to Egypt, and I'll see that you're taken care of. And they did. And Jacob died after he got reunited with Joseph. But before he died, Jacob made Joseph promise, when I die, you take me back to the land of my fathers and bury me there. And Joseph promised him that he would. Now, let's look at chapter 50. I wish we had time really to deal with some of these intervening chapters, but we don't. So let's look at chapter 50 and read verses 1 through 9. Joseph threw himself upon his father and wept over him and kissed him. Then Joseph directed the physicians in his service to embalm his father Israel. So the physicians embalmed him, taking a full 40 days, for that was the time required for embalming. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. When the days of mourning had passed, Joseph said to Potiphar's court, if I have found favor in your eyes, speak to Pharaoh for me. Tell him, my father made me swear an oath and said, I'm about to die. Bury me in the tomb I dug for myself in the land of Canaan. And let me go up and bury my father, then I will return. Pharaoh said, go and bury your father as he has made you swear to do. So Joseph went up to bury his father. All Pharaoh's officials accompanied him, the dignitaries of his court, and all the dignitaries of Egypt, beside all the members of Joseph's household and his brothers and those belonging to his father's household. Only their children and their flocks and herds were left in Goshen. Chariots and horsemen also went up with him. It was a very large company. Must have been quite a funeral. Quite a burial with all these people. Something happened yesterday that reminded me of this. I don't remember which Major League Baseball team it was, but one of their coaches on one of the major baseball teams lost his son, and it's in today's paper. He lost his son, and the entire coaching staff went with the father to the funeral. And I think they were in Florida for spring training. And the funeral was in San Francisco. And the entire coaching staff flew to San Francisco to be with their friend who had lost his son. And I wonder how many things like that have happened in our world because of Joseph and his friends who left everything in Egypt and made, man, it's a hard trip. Wasn't getting on an airplane and fly. They left everything in Egypt and went back to Canaan. Just help be with Joseph as he buried his daddy. Pretty loyal people, and shows what they felt about Joseph. Now, let's look at verses 16 through 22 of that 50th chapter. Verse 15, I start with. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you're to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of God, of the God of your father. When this message came to Joseph, he wept. Joseph was a man full of compassion, and he forgave his brothers again. And in verse 22, Joseph stayed in Egypt along with all his father's family. He lived 110 years and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children, also the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, who were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land, to the land he promised on an oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Jacob made the sons of Israel swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. But later, he was carried back and buried in Canaan. Any questions about the life of Joseph?
You know, I never thought, that's why I love this class, because things always like, even when you study the same passages over and over, new things come to light.
Right.
I wonder ever, because I always kind of see the stories of Jacob and Esau and Joseph and his family separately. But it makes me wonder, the way Joseph treated like his brothers and all that kind of thing, if Jacob ever shared with him his experience with Esau and how he was afraid to go back and meet Esau because he was terrified of what he was going to do with him. And it makes me wonder if Joseph knew any of that, and could that be part of the reason that he chose not to seek revenge? You know, I don't know.
Well, you know, all we can do is speculate because we don't know. But I can't imagine, as close as they were, that Jacob didn't share some of that
Right.
family history.
Yeah.
You know how families get together and talk about the past?
Yeah.
And so I can't imagine Jacob not doing it,
Right.
but we have no proof of
Yeah.
it.
It seems very dangerous to be the favorite.
Oh,
To be handsome
Yeah.
and brilliant and,
it is.
You have to temper your brilliance.
But you know, in that culture, the oldest son was always the cherished one, and Jacob kind of turned the tables, and his younger sons became the favorite.
Right.
So in a way, he was kind of bucking the system. You know.
Very definitely. Okay, I want to leave you with one question for you to discuss. Many theologians say that Joseph was the Christ figure of the Old Testament. He was the Christ figure of the Old Testament. That he was more like Jesus than any other person in the Old Testament. So I want to ask you, what are some characteristics of Moses? What are some characteristics of Joseph that remind you of Jesus?
Long-suffering.
Long-suffering.
Extremely long.
The ability to forgive.
The ability to forgive.
Also the ability to forget.
I'm sorry?
Also the ability to forget.
Mm-hmm.
Forgive and forget.
Yeah.
He's generous.
Generous.
I think he saw God's hand in everything that happened to him
Yeah.
along the way.
Yeah. What about his capacity to love? Jesus was the epitome of love. And Joseph was able to love. And he was not sinless, to be sure. But in my opinion, he was probably more like Jesus than any other figure in the Old Testament. And,
You know, Bill, when you start the class today, you say something about dysfunctional family. And that's very standard, quite a compliment for a family in the Old Testament. It's so dysfunctional,
Yep.
and even to this day. And I was just amazed. Through the Old Testament, each stories, they tell you what God in the stories. So always have God, a third person in the story. It's not husband, wife, it's not the king and whatever it may be, but it's besides all of this dysfunction, it's very much God in the stories. That's why Old Testament is kind of very interesting to me and to all of you guys. And how through this love letter of Old Testament, and each chapter reflecting a mighty God in a picture.
Yep.
Like you told about your own stories. And all of you probably have your own story if you write it down. And you will see it. How God plays in that story, your own stories. How you met. And I love to hear Don told us many times how he fall in love with Barbara way back in Oklahoma. All the stories. And believe me, sometimes in your life, God was in the picture already, years back, and until you can see later. And I think all of you, in fact, when I first came here, I asked how Danny met Laura. I think I met in the camp, is that right?
Yep.
You know, see how God was in to put himself into a story way back.
Yeah, Robert, that's a good summation, because God is in the midst of all of our lives, and we don't always be aware of that at the time when things are bad. But He's there, and He wants to take the bad and work it out for good. Dennis?
Thank you, Bill. Okay, let's go through our prayer requests.
Good job, Bill.
Yeah,
Thank you,
very
Bill.
much. Appreciate that, always. Okay, the two members that are on the women's retreat, we talked about Vicki and Linda Golzer. Pray for Christine C. Dale's friend from Starbucks. How Dale, tell me about this, Dale.
She's a young girl that's assistant manager. I've seen her every day for, 4 years, and she got bit really badly by a dog in her
Oh,
face.
my.
And it was horrible, so she was on leave for a month, and her boss called me, and they knew each other from recovery, and she's relapsed, because it's like my kid's age, it's just so sad. I saw her, she's back at work, and she's falling back in, it
Oh,
was just
my.
sad. She said, could you pray for her? And I said, sure.
For Christine, okay, very good, we'll do that, thank you. We pray for China, for all the countries affected by the COVID-19 virus. Pray for the scientists researching to find a cure and to learn how it's spread. So yes, let's continue to pray for that. My sister-in-law, Dean Smith, is having open heart surgery tomorrow at Mayo. 2 valves replaced and an electrical problem as well to take care of. Please pray for those church members who are on tour of Spain and Portugal. They leave Thursday, February 27th, and return March the 10th. So I hope they have a safe trip on that. Yes, you're gonna be gone with that tomorrow? Okay, safe travels. You're gonna have a great trip. Any other prayer requests we have? If not, thank you, Bill, very much for leading us, and we'll pray and then go down to church. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day and time to come and study your scripture and read your words and have a story that when you look back on it, has a life that was full of your hand in leading Joseph through all of these trials, and having the ability to see your hand in that after looking back on his life. Father, we pray for our members who are at the women's retreat, for Vicki Beasley and for Linda Golzer, and for all the other women that are there, a safe journey back home. We pray for Christine, Dale's friend from Starbucks, that she might recover from this dog bite, that she might heal from that injury. We pray for all those in China and other countries affected by the COVID-19 virus, that the scientists might find a cure and understand how the disease is spread. We pray for my sister-in-law, Dean Smith, as she has open heart surgery tomorrow at Mayo Clinic. And we pray for those church members who will be in Spain and Portugal as they leave on February 27th and return on March the 10th. Father, we thank you for Wilshire. Help us to be your hands and feet in this part of the world. We pray. Amen.
No, I'm like very so I still haven't. I know exactly what I'm doing. Everything first to really look forward. Thank you, Bill. Well, and it's just
We're going to Irving for brunch. Work, and you guys at Luby's. That we went to early service. I'm going to meet a friend. Won't see you today.
Robert gets up in the middle of the night, anyway.
It's at 3:30. They're emailing me at 4:30. Did you have a good week?
Which is great. It is great. You don't, well, you guys be safe.
Thank you. I'd like to go home and Paris, Texas.
Okay, very good. You guys be careful.
Thank you, okay. Think of another